Now we're going to talk about EBV, or Epstein-Barr virus, which is HHV4. Almost 100% of adults have been previously infected by EBV, and it causes 90% of infectious mononucleosis, commonly called mono. What is mono and why are there other causes? We'll get to that in a second, but let's start by just talking about EBV infection. So first, try to remember that EBV can infect the following cell types: epithelial cells, B cells, and T cells. And I'm writing T cells in gray because they're a little less important. But if you know these cell types, then everything about EBV is going to be a little easier to remember. For example, the pathogenesis. A new EBV infection occurs when saliva gets from one person's mouth to another. No surprise then that it's called the kissing disease. So EBV enters the new person's mouth and infects epithelial cells in the pharynx. It replicates in those and spreads around the oropharynx until it finds its main target, B cells, and also, less importantly, a few T cells. And where are those going to be? Well, they'll be in the lymphoid tissue of the oropharynx, which we call tonsils. Now, the B cells then traffic throughout the lymphoid tissues of the body, which is normal whether they're infected or not, and this allows the infection to spread to these other lymphoid tissues. And after some time, the infection is controlled with a combination of antibodies that bind the free-floating virus and cytotoxic T cells that kill infected B cells. So that's EBV infection. This whole process takes about 4 to 8 weeks. Now here's the thing. In most people, it's asymptomatic. And that's good because, as we said, almost everybody gets infected by EBV at some point. But in those who do get symptoms, those symptoms are what we call mono. And they're pretty logical now that we know the pathophysiology. So you get fever, not surprising, happens in many infections. You get pharyngitis, and that's caused, of course, by the infection of epithelial cells in the pharynx. You get lymphadenopathy, usually cervical lymphadenopathy, because cervical lymph nodes drain the pharynx and tonsils where the infection starts. But as we said, the infected B cells traffic throughout the lymphoid tissues of the body, so you can actually get lymphadenopathy anywhere. And then you can get fatigue. Now, it's normal to get fatigue when you're sick, but with mono, the fatigue is exaggerated, and we don't really know why. And finally, you get atypical lymphocytosis. Now, what is that? Well, normally, lymphocytes in the blood look like this, with a small nucleus and very little cytoplasm. But in mono, you find lymphocytes in the blood that look like this, with a much bigger nucleus and lots of cytoplasm. We call these atypical lymphocytes. And what are they? Well, they're reactive cytotoxic T cells that are trying to kill the infected B cells. And fine, that makes sense, but you might be wondering, if atypical lymphocytes are just activated cytotoxic T cells, then why don't we see them in other viral infections? And the answer is we do. So this is not specific to mono, but mono does tend to have more of them because so many B cells get infected and need to be killed. And this last point actually takes us full circle to the name infectious mononucleosis. So what does mononucleosis mean? It means there are a lot of mononuclear cells in the blood. And what are mononuclear cells? Well, they're white blood cells that do not have segmented nuclei, which neutrophils and eosinophils do. So the name mononucleosis just refers to the fact that there are a lot of lymphocytes in the blood. And some of those, but not all, are going to be atypical. There are other signs of mono. An important one is splenomegaly. The spleen, you might know, has a lot of B cells, so inevitably infected B cells go to the spleen, and cytotoxic T cells follow them, trying to kill them. And that makes the spleen swell up in about half of people with mono. And why do we care about that? Well, because just like an inflated balloon, an inflated spleen is more likely to burst. And splenic rupture, as it's called, can cause a lot of blood loss. So people with mono should avoid contact sports and other situations that could cause splenic rupture. And now, just before we finish, a quick note about the causes of mono. So we said in the beginning that EBV causes 90% of mono. But you may have noticed that none of these mono symptoms we discussed is really unique to EBV. And so it's not surprising that other infectious agents can produce some or all of them too, and therefore qualify as mono clinically. And the most common other causes of mono are CMV, HIV, toxoplasmosis, and hepatitis viruses. And these aren't going to be identical. They're going to look a little different from EBV mono, but it's too much detail for us to go into now.